using AI for our research. But before that, I would love to introduce our wonderful panelists. We will bring up their bios for those of you who are not familiar with their wonderful work in technology and research, in education. And I'm just going to get that in a moment. So we will start with Mr. John Pasmore, who is the Chief Executive Officer of a wonderful organization. I would love for you, Mr. Pasmore, to give us some more information about your organization, if you will. It's all about AI in the voice of the African and African American diaspora.
Yeah,
It's
well, what we
called
did,
LatimerAI.
you want me to just jump in and give you a kind of high level?
That would be perfect. Thank you
Yeah.
very much.
Sure, sure. Hello, everybody. John Pasmore, founder, CEO of LatimerAI. We built what we call an inclusive large language model. So actually, Latimer is a database that is trained with additional Black and Brown history and content ranging from the New York Amsterdam News to 1925 to present, and many, many other sources of data that allows the several foundation models. Within Latimer, you have access to about 10 different models. And our database makes those models more culturally fluent in Black and Brown history and culture, to make it brief.
Thank you very much. Next up, we will introduce Dr. Sylvea Hollis. She's an associate professor in African American history at Montgomery College. Her career began at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, where she initially interned and subsequently worked in the departments of education and exhibitions. Dr. Hollis's training at BCRI launched her career, leading to a project manager role at the American Alliance of Museums Center for the Future of Museums, 2 exhibition-based research fellowships at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, and a Mellon postdoctoral fellowship with the National Park Service and National Park Foundation. Dr. Hollis, would you like to tell us more about yourself?
Certainly. So I'm an educator, also a public historian, particular interest in African American history. And I entered this conversation thinking about how AI can contribute to critical thinking skills for students, how it can be used to leverage lines of inquiry in terms of research projects, but also come kind of early on as a bit of a curmudgeon for the technology. And so I'm in the middle of advocate and also a kind of consistent scrutinizer of how we use what we use.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Next, we'll introduce Dr. Kimberly Springer. She's a private advocate with the Library Freedom Project, a national network for librarians committed to building and defending information democracy. Dr. Springer brings ethics and best practices around privacy, freedom of information, and data security to her curatorial labor in Columbia University's archives and special collections. Dr. Springer, would you like to tell us a little more about yourself?
Sure, just briefly. First, thank you for organizing this. I think it's a really critical conversation that we have at this juncture. And I'm probably going to join the curmudgeon train, but I don't think about it as curmudgeonness as much as really wanting us to think about the ethical aspects of using AI, particularly as it's being rolled out now in what we in the Library Freedom Project consider to be an AI hype cycle. And that hype cycle is very much about marketing AI to us as if it's thinking and intelligent, as opposed to being media synthesis machines. So machines that gather a bunch of data and put that data back out there. And sometimes it's bad data in, bad data out. And so I'll be responding to questions from that perspective and how we can think about what we value and also how we refuse AI and then what we're saying yes to in that refusal.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Next, we have Dr. Imani Cooper Mkandawire. She is an interdisciplinary artist and researcher whose work bridges artistic inquiry with critical explorations of science and technology. From training AI models on oral histories to translating mathematical equations into poetic forms, she reimagines how knowledge is encoded, preserved, and shared. Dr. Cooper Mkandawire, would you tell us more about yourself, please?
Yeah, of course. So I am founder of Undisciplined, which is a research and development studio, and it's focused on cultural computing. So what I do there is preserve African and African diasporic knowledge systems by building computational models around them and exploring that scientific heritage. I also work in the capacity of revitalization manager of a cultural house and bookstore in Kingstree, South Carolina. And so I'm also thinking about AI in terms of digital upskilling and community involvement. So, and then, my background is in traditional scholarship and where I studied the mathematics of AI, machine learning, and thinking about it critically from that perspective of the data going in and how does that map onto the mathematics of it.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you very much. Well, as you all can see, we have an all-star team here to discuss all things AI, well, as much as we can get into 1 hour anyway. So the structure of our program is introductions, which we've just done, many intros as well, and a moderated discussion with preset questions. So we'll start and jump right in with our very first question. Feel free to jump in where you'd like, panelists, please. The first question is, what does AI currently look like in your area of work, either collecting, researching, or writing?
I can jump in. I mean, what we've done is we've actually built an AI platform and deployed it. I am a graduate of Columbia University as well for a computer science degree. We didn't really launch it as an ed tech platform, so to speak, but we've gotten so many inquiries from higher ed in particular that's been the focus of how we're rolling out Latimer. We're now in front of thousands of students across a lot of different organizations, and I know, judging by the panel, that's both, I don't know, welcoming and troubling at the same time. It certainly has a host of issues. I like to say that, OpenAI basically launched their product without fully researching everything. So we're all kind of, testing this new technology and building the plane while we're flying it. But higher education, for the most part, for us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pasmore. Any other panelists want to speak to how AI is currently looked at in your current area of work? I see Dr. Hollis has her hand raised.
Yes, I want to say as a researcher and as an educator, particularly rooted in African American history, something that has been cathartic and fascinating has been how AI is able to provide access to spaces for research that had before felt much more difficult to do. And I can be a little bit more tangible about that. A couple years ago, in the wake of 2020, the Alabama Department of Archives and History published a kind of statement about their complicity in not being forthright in collecting content tied to African American history. They had been more forthright in collecting material tied to the fact that Montgomery was the first capital of the Confederacy, and pro-slavery narratives, and narratives that do this longer line of what, through my lens, I would think about the longer freedom struggle. They were telling a longer narrative on the other side of that. And so what that means is the institution is now doing its own work to excavate archives that could have long been in their body But what AI does for the research, when I think about OCR, like optical character recognition, being able to scan material and do be able to have more robust search engines, natural language processing, things like speech recognition for oral history interviews, and being able to scan particular and find particular components. It has like flattened and created a kind of access for researchers to be able to move around the problems with some institutional archives. And so that is heartening. The difficult part about it is for the classroom is you still have to have your critical thinking skills. So being able to ask questions of even if you find this material, where it comes from, what it means, not reading text literally, which is hard sometimes, still is work to be done. But I am very heartened by even like the Freedmen's Bureau search portal, what that has been able to do is a kind of a remarkable space of use for myself personally, but also as my students.
That's a great point that you made about critical thinking. And as I've used AI in my own work, if I had not already had the knowledge of, for example, library science and archival practices, some of the things that I get out of the AI and not having been able to correct would be problematic in my line of work. So I believe it's very important for people to have knowledge skill sets, critical thinking skills, project management skills, also, for example, to direct the AI in doing the things you need it to do. And it really is more of a human AI team versus AI taking over any specific task. Just something that I found. Would anyone else like to speak to this before we move on to the next question? I see Dr. Springer has her hand raised.
Thank you for surfacing those issues around access, because particularly for institutional archives, that's always a big concern. I'm going to pivot from that just for a second to think about consent. And as in my job, I'm the curator of the oral history collection at Columbia. So we do the acquisitions, we do some training in how to use oral histories as primary sources. But then I also field requests for using those materials. And lately, one of those requests has been overtures from AI companies that want to scrape our interviews and add our thousands of interviews to their large language models. And this is problematic. I've said no, I have refused because, for one thing, the narrators who gave their consent to be interviewed over the years, they didn't predict the internet. So we have concerns about publishing their words online, period. But also, they did not give their consent to have their words or their stories used in these large language models. And another aspect that I find really interesting for oral history is that a lot of transcription tools that didn't used to have AI have now put AI into their marketing tools and into their platforms. And that has some interesting implications for, how they transcribe voices, how they transcribe dialect, what some of these AI platforms choose to leave out because they don't recognize it as standard English. So that really sort of speaks to the need for being able to critically analyze and sort of go back and compare the transcripts and the audio. Also, a big concern that I think people should consider when using transcription platforms is what happens to your granny stories when you upload them to these platforms. So do they become the property of the platforms? I always recommend looking at the privacy policy for any platform, and in particular at the section about how we use your data, because there's a lot of legalese there, but what you really want to know is like, is your material being stored locally on your computer so that you still have kind of control over it? Or is it being uploaded into the cloud? And then what kind of accountability do the platforms have for your materials?
That leaves a lot of food for thought. Thank you, Dr. Springer. So we will move on to the next question. Question number 2. Can you share one practical example where AI has improved efficiency or access in your work? Dr. Cooper Mkandawire?
Yeah, I can jump in. I would say, um, I'm coming from a perspective of cultural computing, and what that looks like is really questioning how AI thinks. When we say artificial intelligence, whose intelligence is that? What do you mean by intelligence? And so the goal then is to think about these myriad of different ways of what you call epistemologies, ontologies, these large words of thinking about the ways we do and the cultural beliefs behind that. And so I think using AI has, in a practical way, has helped me kind of see the Internet of Things when I'm on like my Copilot or Chat GPT account, and I come up against a wall where I'm like, oh, okay, like this data does not exist. You are having a hard time understanding and locating what I'm trying to talk about. And it kind of gives me an idea of what is on the Internet of Things and how does it mirror back how it's understanding, in my case, Black history, the African diaspora, the African experience. And so that's been interesting. But on another effort, being a founder of a research and development studio, and then also sitting on a board to revitalize a cultural house, and then being an artist, it's really helped to kind of consolidate the many facets of, here I'm talking about, for a current project, I'm in the intersection of African music, polyrhythms, and neuroscience. And then I have to jump over and think about community digital upskilling. And I think it really helps to synthesize language to make sure I'm not carrying one jargon over from the next, and making sure that I am localized and speaking to the correct audience I am supposed to be speaking to. That.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. Mr. Passmore, I'd love to hear your answer on this question about how AI has improved efficiency or access in your work.
Two things, just an aside, and I think it's kind of come up, but we should recognize that a lot of African American, not only oral histories, but we're working with a university that has 15 million pages of unscanned data. So there's a ton of what we would even consider general Black history, not even something that's super private, that's just not scanned. So no AI has it. And every time the CEO of OpenAI, Sam Altman, says, "Hey, we've read the entire internet," as if that means his AI knows everything, we should think, well, there's a lot of stuff that's not on the internet, so there's a big kind of blind spot there still. But with that said, I mean, we use it all the time. I find it as an entrepreneur like super helpful in making business presentations. So, and then, once you get one, or let's say you get a request for a proposal, you could just simply upload that request for proposal and ask it to, respond. And the more it knows, obviously, about you, about your business, the better. There's certainly just a complete host of privacy concerns if you are a person concerned about your privacy. I think, to a large extent, because many people, especially young people, use a lot of social media, they can pretty much assume that their privacy kind of that ship has sailed, and that a lot of what they might consider their personal life is in the public domain. But if the more the AI does know about a business or what you're trying to get done, the more effective or fast it can be at creating a document or a proposal.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would love to hear from one of the resident curmudgeons relating to whether any improved efficiency or access has come up in your work with the use of AI.
I want to say similar to what's been referenced before is what it becomes evidence for. So when I first started playing around with ChatGPT, I'm a lay person, I feel like maybe only a couple of years ago, what I saw was a lack of basic understanding of African American history, to the point at which my thesis was essentially, when will AI see us? And it shifted to now, how does AI see us? So one way I use it is just to interrogate the technology itself. Uh, um, and it's helpful as a researcher, it's helpful as an educator. But in saying that, it reminds me the value of its utility, but also the value of traditional academic scholarship's utility. And I'll speak specifically as a historian, thinking about historiography and how new scholarship contributes to deeper understandings of previous scholarship. And one thing AI I can't imagine it doing in the future is staying relevant and being able to do nuanced readings of how new scholarship creates interventions in the field. So works that come out that I'll give you just a kind of crude example. Works that come out that look at the history of the civil rights movement in a very traditional way may tell it in a very basic way. But if the archive if the archive that's being mined, similar to what Mr. Pasmore said, isn't looking at collections that show about the role of women in grassroots movement or the role of queer people involved in that movement, then that story isn't told in the same type of way. Or even the history of the early history of how Rosa Parks' inclination towards civil rights didn't come through sitting on a bus. It came through her fight for Black women's sexual protection. Those are her early cases, like Reese Taylor. What does that have to do with what I'm talking about? What it has to do with what I'm talking about is it shows the limits of it. And if you know the limits of it, that means you can know the strengths of it. So one way I use it is to interrogate like the whole body of what this thing is meant for, and also why it's important to tap into the things that it can't do and likely won't be able to do in the same way that we can through our own intellectual interrogations.
That's wonderful. Thank you for breaking that down for us. So we'll go ahead and move on to question number 3. How do you balance AI tools with traditional archival or research standards? I think you talked to some of that just now, Dr. Hollis. Would anyone else like to tackle that question?
I'm not an archivist, but I will say we're kind of on the other side of the coin, because we're looking for data to add to Latimer, and a lot of the data that we want is in archives, and some archives, you know, a really actually fairly large private, or it's a commercial company, is ProQuest, and it creates a funny scenario for us. As I mentioned, we receive the data for the New York Amsterdam News, second oldest Black newspaper in the United States. That was actually scanned by ProQuest. So in many instances, there's kind of a gray area, because sure, the Amsterdam News owns the underlying work, but if a company does the actual scanning, well, who owns the digital copy? And again, because AI wasn't thought of when many of these scans were made, it's unclear. So you literally have probably a billion pages that's just sitting in a gray area that nobody really wants to pay to rescan them. But also, if you're the Chicago Defender, if you want to license your content, let's say, for instance, hypothetical, um, you don't have your history of the oldest Black newspaper in the United States. You don't have a digital copy of it. So, we're working through a lot of issues, I think, with archives, because AI is somewhat of an unanticipated use of these digital copies.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Stringer.
I like the phrasing of this question, because it is about a balance, I think. So for oral histories, there's the traditional method of listening to an oral history or reading the transcript. Sometimes people do both together, because you can see where the transcription platform, whether or not it uses AI, might have left things out or flatten the experience. So I think there's still value in listening to oral histories in that way, because you're going to get pauses, you're going to hear laughter, you might hear emotion creep in particular ways that aren't captured necessarily by the software. And I think also, just transcribing back in the day could take hours to do it, to do it sort of by hand and type it out. So I think I always advocate for you have to edit the AI generated transcript because there are proper nouns, there are names that it will get wrong. Um, so I think that, but even that editing and listening to the transcript maintains the intimacy of hearing somebody's story rather than thinking you've put it through the machine and it's come out perfect.
That's a great point. I think about even in watching things on Netflix or YouTube and reading the captions, how some of the wording and phrases can be incorrect and you can't really capture, to your point, the emotion of something.
Yeah. And if
or
it's a different,
capture.
if it's a different language and you know that language, the ways that the English captions will rephrase it or make it mean something that maybe it doesn't necessarily mean. So I think there's that translation that happens that I think is useful to be aware for. That's a good research skill.
Absolutely. Great
Can I just
point.
jump in? I'm really curious while I have all of these archivists here, because there's a tension, right? So, like I was visiting with a professor from Morehouse who had to go to New York to get he was doing research. They had to go to the Schomburg, physically go to the Schomburg. So that's an incredibly expensive effort and tends to then obviously favor people that can afford to travel and go to the Schomburg. And I would assume that the same is true in terms of the limit of access to the Columbia transcripts of oral histories. Isn't it a better service, I think, to the community at large for as many people as possible to have access to that kind of data?
That's a great question because I think there have been sort of changes or these reactions. Tested. There have been sort of changes and I think evolutions of how we think about access in archives. And a lot of that has come from our colleagues in libraries who libraries are prioritizing people having access to things. And so then there are those of us who work in these institutional archives that are trying to change the ethos sort of emotionally and empathically about who has access to that space. We do face the barriers of places like Columbia that have decided to close their gates to the surrounding community. So there's definitely that access issue. But in terms of the material, I'd also speak to there's the idea that if you digitize everything and just put it on the web, that everybody has access to it. But there are still barriers there for people to access them, whether they have high-speed internet access, for example. And can they download something that's been uploaded in a really complicated way? Um, and I think there's also sort of understanding how one can come to work with archival materials, that some of that education happens in person. So I definitely think there's like a lot that we can do to improve access, but I would push back against this idea that we just put everything on the web and then everyone will have access. Because I think we do still have a considerable digital divide in this country that we need to take into account.
Yes, agreed. There is also a cost aspect relating to digitization in and of itself, that there's a cost to hiring someone to digitize that's on the side of the repository, either the library, the archive, etc. And with the funding for these institutions becoming a little limited, that becomes a challenge as well, just to be fully transparent.
Could I dive in as well?
Absolutely.
I just wanted to add on to the tension in terms of, if these, I know Pasmore, you talked about having like there was a data set of about 15,000 of like African American language data that was not actually digitized. And I'm currently working on a model that deals with rhythm and neuronal transmit, so how your brain syncs up with rhythm. And it's particularly taking rhythm from the African diaspora. And the issue I'm facing is even if it is digitized in the archive, the specific cultural data I'm looking for, it is not permitted to be used for AI anyway. And so I'm also thinking about this tension of even if it is digitized, does that mean that it can be used for the development of models or for AI research? And what does that do then, I guess, to Black communities when you think about, data dearth, algorithmic bias, when the data is digitized, it cannot be used. And then what would be then a new ethical model? What would we like to see that then the technology doesn't have to be inhibited, but neither do the communities have to be at risk? And I'm sitting in this tension where I know where the data is, I know where I want to use it, but I'm really coming up against this wall of consent and people who do want to see and imagine, Black knowledge in the future and be used for great things. But where did we fall?
That's a great tension point to introduce to us, Dr. Cooper and Mkandawire, that hopefully smart people like Mr. Pasmore and others can help resolve in the near future.
I'm
With
not
that,
sure that we have, and I mean, we're a for-profit company, and I think anybody that's concerned about ethics should not that we're unethical, but you should be have a healthy concern about the tension that for-profit companies have, and we kind of already have seen, right, that the foundation models that essentially created AI essentially plundered content as much as they could get, regardless of who owned it. If it was accessible to a spider on the internet, they ingested it, whether or not they had permission or not. Then you have another layer that'll probably come up in the next 2 years before we move on from this administration, where everything with AI is being framed in terms of like geopolitical risk. Like, hey, China doesn't have these guardrails, so we're kind of putting ourselves at a disadvantage by maybe not having our AI have access to all content. So maybe for AI, copyright shouldn't matter. So I'm sure that that will come up in terms of the, hey, what are our, adversaries doing? And we have to match what they're doing.
thank you. That is definite food for thought, adding that geopolitical layer to the technological conversation. Thank you for that. We're going to go ahead and move on to question number 4 now. And that question, I think we've answered just a little bit already. What ethical or bias related concerns do you think our field needs to be most mindful of?
Well, once again, I'll jump in. I think for me, I have an 18-year-old son, and that was really my motivation of starting Latimer, because if you remember in 2023, we were seeing really, really egregious examples of bias and essentially, racism that was coming out of these models. And I think that we have to understand that data really hasn't been erased from these models. We built guardrails around it, so it doesn't necessarily say the same things that it would have said in 2023, but people jailbreak models to get them to say those objectionable things. So we know that data is in there. So the bias that I'm most concerned about is really just that on some level, and maybe it's better that we can actually see it and understand it, as opposed to it being very subtle, and it still shows up. So for instance, in employment, they've found that somehow the AI will make a judgment based on the name of the person who's submitting an employment application, without it being apparent that has any significance in terms of that person's actual capability to do the job. So somehow there's a bias that shows up in healthcare. So now we're using these models in healthcare. We're using them in law enforcement. We're using them in ways that we don't even know in terms of our government or defense. So I think I think for us, bias is a huge concern that we should be focused on.
Thank you, Ms. Pasmore.
I think also building on that, the kind of ethical use means being aware of the environmental impact that's on the other side of this use, what it's meant in communities, particularly of color, and even on the people that are whether some of the early hirees for the training the systems, taking out violent language, taking what we know that the Global South was used in those earlier iterations, and people were paid insufficiently for that very kind of mentally and emotionally violent work of pulling out certain types of content. And I know that's not on us as researchers, but there's just like a conscious awareness of it as a legacy. And somewhat tied to what Dr. Springer was talking about in terms of copyright, but also a different type of context. It's the provenance piece, like archives and provenance and where materials come from. For many scholars, the field is only within the past 10 to 15 years of really interrogating that in some substantive ways, particularly in African American history. I'm thinking about scholars like Dr. Saidiya Hartman, was like in Christina Sharp's interrogations. And so if we just, I'm going back to Mr. Passmore's concept of who gets left out when they can't physically go into the archive, what AI open access looks like needs to, if it is all of these thousands of pages scanned, needs to have some kind of contextual information for that process of what these materials are, where they came from, why were they collected, what stories they're tied to. And a closing piece I have is just as a kind of traditional scholar of what it is to go into an archive, prepare cognitive behaviorally. Go through your sources, go through your footnotes, and go in. There's a kind of ritual, and it's not that the building is sacred, but it's the practice that's special. And we just use technology just ubiquitously. And so there's not necessarily, for young scholars, you may be training the same type of reverence to the archive. And so I worry in a period when misinformation is rampant of the ethical use of just spreading so many primary sources without arming folks to be able to interrogate them, and this kind of TikTokification of history. I'm curious where and how AI institutions can be supportive in that interrogation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Springer.
I would just add, because the Library Freedom Project, we work from a basis of harm reduction in terms of our privacy. And so that means that whether the ship has sailed or the horse has left the barn or the bus has left the depot, we still have a right to privacy. And it's something that we as Black people and our ancestors, privacy was one of the things they fought for. They fought to be free of surveillance. So I'm not laying this just at the door of AI, but I think with a lot of these technologies, we really need to help our kids understand what privacy is and what it's meant, and that just because you have signed on to a platform's like privacy policy, that doesn't necessarily mean that you've given up your unenumerated right to privacy.
Thank you. Thank you. There are some very big concerns relating to privacy, as a number of you have pointed out. When you provide information to teach the learning model, you don't know where that information will go. So that's a great reason to segue into our next question. So, question number 5, panelists. Where do you see AI making the biggest impact in the next 5 years?
I'm gonna say in the environmental, I guess either justice or climate change. I know right now AI is using a lot of our natural water, right? A natural resource. And I think that's one of the scarier, you know, anti-AI platforms that is being used now. I was thinking about AI and climate change. And so I think most innovation may come from eco-friendly data centers or thinking about, I guess, just the material impact of AI. There's a race for it. And I think in that race, we forget about the material impact of it and the migration habits it's causing animals to do, the loss of water, the degradation of the ozone layer. And, so I think we can race as much as we can, but we can't outrun the natural resources that we actually, need to live on. And when that comes to an ultimatum, I think the innovation would lie there, thinking of AI and climate change.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper and Mkandawire. Anyone else?
Yeah, I think what we should maybe not focus on it to the degree that it's frightening, but Meta has changed their mission statement, and it's the mission of OpenAI and others to create artificial general intelligence. And we hear varying predictions from it'll be here tomorrow till it'll be here a decade from now. But it's coming, and so I would assume I would look at like AI like we're in the first inning, and I look at it like we're creating it's almost its own entity, right? So it's a synthetic entity, and what we've created has the potential to be smarter than us. It can be that potential has a lot of people worried about, let's say, job impacts. Anybody that's working whose primary job is to work in front of a computer, it's very it's not hard to imagine that an AI can probably do their job, or that there's many fewer people that are needed as investment analysts or insurance companies, or you see huge companies, Amazon, Microsoft, UPS, either freezing or releasing staff in anticipation of the evolution of AI. So, I think we should just be aware that we are evolving very quickly an entity that is probably going to be smarter than us. We have been, for as long as we've existed on this planet, the apex entity or being, and we may have unwittingly or wittingly created something that is smarter than us.
With that being said, there are some things that AI cannot do. So, for example, I won't say cannot do, but are less likely to do. So, for example, purchase homes to live in, purchase groceries to eat. Those are still very human things. So there's a question of who will be left to pay for mortgages and groceries if no one's employed to purchase those things.
I definitely.
I'm sorry.
All right.
Dr.
No,
Hollis.
I was just thinking about what Mr. Pasmore said. I agree that I think the future of AI, it's certain it will be here in the future. I think the future it will continue to transform the nature of work, how we work, and also how we see each other. And a kind of middle ground is it will expose the essential qualities of being a human that matter most to society, things that civilization is not willing to do away with, and will also magnify the places that are not a priority and didn't need to be and could be managed by technology. And I'm hoping that in that process, something will settle in terms of us as beings and within our various whatever structures we'll find ourselves, because we're kind of moving beyond the traditional boundaries of sovereignty and nation state, whatever conglomerate we find ourselves. I'm hoping that our defense of humanity creates a space that is pure and protected, while we also see work is going to change. The nature of work in the future will change, and AI will transform that for sure.
Thank you, Dr. Hollis. Those are great questions. I see Dr. Springer's hand raised.
I think sort of undergirding all of these, and what I actually hope to see in the next 5 years, is that the law will catch up with the technology. we cannot rely on these big tech companies to regulate themselves. They will go unchecked if we let them and if our legislators let them do that. So I'm thinking about laws in terms of creating deep fakes of people for porn. Like 96% of AI generated porn are deep fakes. And then 90% of those fakes target women. And we know that when white women get a cold, Black women get the flu. So it's disproportionately bad for Black women. I think also in terms of legislating around the platforms being used for psychiatry and how the platforms are then impacting people in terms of their mental health and if they even continue to live. So I think, it's odd for me to be hopeful, but I am hoping that the legislation will get to where it needs to be so that like we can also then really see advances in the technology that are beneficial across a range of different industries and not discriminatory.
Thank you, Dr. Springer. Thank you, panelists all. We will move on to question 6. And that question is, what advice would you give to professionals who feel uncertain about experimenting with AI?
All right, I'll jump in. I mean, at this point, you don't have a choice. I mean, it's, some people compare this to the Industrial Revolution. So, you have, horse and carriages that are being replaced by cars in some senses. And, we actually don't know where AI is going to go. Maybe we're at peak AI and it never gets any smarter than what it is. But already it can do a lot of different tasks, and it can be extremely helpful. If you're working in front of a computer, if your job is to work in front of a computer, it's very simple to begin some form of relationship, begin to test AI, whether that's in your personal interests, whether that's having a conversation. Certainly, as Dr. Springer said, you probably don't want to use AI as a therapist, but we're seeing a lot of people do, or a lot of people use it as some sort of companion that is always there to talk to. But whatever your interest is, you'll probably, be intrigued by its ability to hold a conversation. And I think once you start having conversations with artificial intelligence, you kind of get a little bit hooked in terms of understanding the capabilities.
I have some advice that I would recommend, and like with the caveat that I mean I do use AI. Like if it's sort of a bureaucratic thing that I don't really want to deal with, that the HR department is demanding, I'll put it in AI. So to that end, I would first say that people should ask yourselves a question. So how would you use AI if you assume that everything you put into it is being stored or shared? So that's just a way of kind of being conscious about what you're putting into the machine. Um, I'd also recommend practicing data minimization. So giving the machines as little of your personal information as you need to use it. I'd also say, as or as Mr. Passmore said, being cautious about putting sensitive data into the machines. And then finally, just knowing your rights. So whether it comes to applying for a job and or uploading audio for transcription or using a healthcare platform from your doctor's office, just know what your rights are.
Thank you, Dr. Springer. Anyone else before we move on to question number 7?
I have one that's just pretty practical. You can actually copy and paste a lot of the consent agreements and like liability, those like really small fine print you want to get on an app and it's like scroll, 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 but you don't, you just hit the check and accept. So you can copy and paste that and put it in GPT and ask it. What are my affordances in this? What if this contract breaks? What can I have? So I find that interesting because you could actually use AI to see the consent that's built around the very apps you're using. And it's something that's very long and mundane. You don't want to read it. Why not just get a report and see? And I like to compile those and to see, some type of transparency narrative or any commonalities between the different companies and apps. But it's just one thing that I would say if you're curious about your rights and consent and access to data, copy and paste it and see.
That's a great idea. Have you found any differences between those various platforms?
Any differences? I would say
Yes.
the wording is like a magician. So they're all saying the same thing, but how clever it can be worded, I think has taken me into a deep dive into legality and thinking about legal wording and legal AI and how it's being used in law. I don't just from the sentence structures, but that's a good question that I will go back now and look more tentatively about the different shifts between the language and how each app or company is defining consent, defining liability, because those are very different.
Good point. Thank you. And I did read someplace recently that uh, AI passed the bar exam. I thought that was interesting. So we'll go ahead and move on to question number 7, which is our final question for the panel. That question is, if you had one sentence of guidance for attendees on responsibility using AI, what would it be?
I
One
can, I can, s-
So we'll do
oh,
Dr. Springer
okay.
and then Mr. Passmore.
Okay. I would say just to remember that research is intentionally slow, but if you don't know what slow and tedious is, then you won't know when you have a truly brilliant insight or you stumble across something really incredible.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Springer. Mr. Passmore.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to ask you to repeat your question.
Sure, that question is, if you had one sentence of guidance for attendees on responsibility using AI, what would it be?
Responsibility. I
Yes.
would just remember that this is very much a work in progress. We've talked about privacy. So while you're using it, do be careful and cognizant that you're talking to almost what could be considered a child or a toddler in terms of its development.
Thank you. Dr. Hollis?
You're training it as you use it. So be mindful of what you train it to do and think and ask.
Thank you. Dr. Cooper and Mkandawire?
I would say just don't forget about the materiality. You can't see it, but it has a physical impact on your body and on your community, and on the earth.
Thank you very much. And my parting advice would be to fact check and not take the output of the AI as gospel.
Absolutely.
It looks like we have no questions for our Q&A. So I will give you all your time back. And I thank you all so much for being gracious with your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was really interesting.
You.
Thank you.